Now let's look at, all of the NLC TUC activity through the eyes of the organized private sector.
Okay.
Now, earlier on we were talking about how the clampdown yesterday actually affected a lot of businesses. The greatest amount of people that might have been affected also may or may not have been affected would be the private sector.
Yeah.
How well did the private sector even align with the NLC strike yesterday? So these are some of the things we want to look at through the lens of Dr. Wisdom Enang this morning. Good morning, Doctor. Good to have you on the show this morning.
Good morning, Oyai. Thank you very much. Do appreciate it.
Thank you so much for joining us. How is Abuja today?
Yeah, fantastic. Nice weather. Everything is good.
Okay, so on generally, we'd like to find out how was the air of the strike in Abuja yesterday. News intels and all of the detail that we see. It was a serious one. You being on site in the Federal Capital Territory, how was the experience and what are your thoughts with yesterday's strike?
I think pretty much the way strikes operate in the country, so everyone, businesses are not, for the most part, not functional, and essential services are affected, and of course, sometimes, depending on where you go, the roads are a bit, dry, for lack of a better word. And for that, I mean, you don't see that many vehicles around. So, I mean, it's more like an economic slowdown when it comes to do with strike. And that's why no country would want to have a perpetual strike situation on your hands, because it does affect the state of economy and, the way businesses function.
All right, Dr. Wisdom, I'm coming from the private, organized private sector. I would like to ask, there's been a lot of, we've had the glamoring for 494,000 from NLC as the benchmark for minimum wage. What exactly would you say is what is the private organized? What is the organized private sector? Also, are you guys in tune with the NLC with this amount of money?
I think for going to speak for myself, because I do not run the private sector, but I'll speak from my school of thought. The first problem that I have with the NLC request is the argument I hear is that the federal government can pay this because we have a devalued naira, and that means that there's more federal allocation, from a naira perspective. However, the trouble I'm having is that you're hedging a figure on a weaker currency, and there is no recourse to the effect of that amount on inflation. Because what happens is, the more money you have in circulation, the higher your inflation. And so what would typically happen is, if you, say for example, were able to buy maybe a bag of rice for, say, 7,000 at the moment, once the minimum wage goes up, I can assure you that you'd have a bag of rice selling for over 100K. Not because of every other thing, all things being equal, but just because you have moved the minimum wage up without moving productivity. And so what happens is your exchange power compared to other currencies would fall. And once your exchange power, exchange rate compared to other currencies fall, you would have a weaker amount of currency, but more of it in circulation. And then the second thing is the organized labor has not really thought about how private individuals will pay this. I mean, I'll give you some. So selling a bread factory to pay a shift worker, at least the amounts that have been quoted, in reality, are businesses going to be able to afford it? And we're working numbers. You should work beyond the fact that it's just not the government that is involved. So in a nutshell, I'd like to say this, right? There's need for an increment, right, to be able to match the realities of the day. But I'd like to say also that the reality.
Okay,
I think we're having some interference there. But I don't know. Analysts will tell you, give different perspective, give you different reasons why we cannot have, the increment in the minimum wage. Back.
You could have the inflation go to 50%, and then you could also have things like the exchange rate go even worse. What are you going to do? Will you keep increasing the minimum wage? That is more like treating the symptoms. What I'd like to see is organized labor calling for the treatment of the underlying condition, which is to fix the macroeconomics that are currently skewed. Can we tame the volatility exchange rates? Can we reduce our inflation? Can we have a better domestic pricing outlook? That is the first and primary thing. And then when that has been held constant in a very deterministic way, we can then begin to talk about minimum wage. Otherwise, I'll hold my position that you're mainly treating the symptoms and not the underlying conditions.
So in talking about dealing with the symptoms, some of the comparison that has risen up at this time is comparing what the minimum wage in Nigeria and some of the African nations are. From different people's perspectives, some may think, okay, this is a wise move. Others may think it's not wise. But for nations that are not even comparable with us economically, we have the highest at Gabon. 370. Now, when we convert what they earn to naira, that is 376,500 naira as a minimum wage. And then Nigeria is saying if we peg at even 150,000 that we cannot pay. Dr. Wisdom, and some of the problem that we have is, now the conversation we're having before you came is, our politicians are earning so much more that if we inject a good fare as minimum wage and try to shore up the system and the economy in all of those other ways that you're saying, don't you think that it will make the standard of living better for Nigerians?
No, we would not. And this is a problem. We are comparing an apple with an orange, and that's my struggle. Because everything, the minimum wage, as I said, is just a figurative amount. And the truth is, okay, so I'll give you context. Look at Zimbabwe now. You could earn easily $1 million, Zimbabwean dollars. But does it mean anything? It absolutely doesn't mean anything. So those are just comparative numbers. The real thing is, does your take home really take you home? And by take home really taking you home, I'm talking about, does your, the amount of money that you earn, does that help you in terms of domestic pricing, domestic product, not really imported products? That's the truth. Because I can tell you also, I can give you an analogy where in countries like Thailand, you have very low numbers of their wages compared to the dollar, but then you can live off that amount very comfortably. Let's not even go to Thailand. Let's go to somewhere in Europe, Georgia. In Georgia, you could survive, basically you could go on with your life with $200 on a daily basis, and that's Europe. Mm-hmm. So it depends on, what I'm saying is, let's not, compare the validity of the amounts we earn and looking at how it will suffice without looking at the macroeconomic factors. I agree that when you want to demonetize the politics, that's an area that that's an area for a complete new area for another day for us to look at. But the conversation at hand is, we should not go in isolation of looking at what is the situation in Nigeria. Those countries you are citing are not passing through the same inflation situation. Our inflation is going out of control. You make the mistake to agree to those rates. I bet you'll be buying a bag of rice for 250,000. That's not what you want. Nobody wants that. And I'm not going to sit here and join and say what is going to get us in more trouble. When you're about to do things that it's like you have a house on fire, and someone is telling you, look, do not use this extinguisher because it doesn't work for this fire. It might even make it worse. And you're saying, but the other guy had a fire and used that extinguisher. The truth is, were you there to know the sort of fire they had, the different classes of fire and different classes of extinguishers? Some would make it worse if you're using the wrong fire extinguisher. So essentially, my point is, we are having a hyperinflation situation. I dare to even say that we're getting very close to having a stagflation situation where we have a hyperinflation, we have a low amount of productivity, and then low amount of jobs. For the active population. You dare to put things that would inflate that, you would end up with a Zimbabwean situation, you will end up with a Venezuelan situation. So let's be very careful, because I don't think we're doing enough of the economic assessment. I think we're just crunching numbers and saying, well, if this is the exchange rate, this is the FAC allocation, definitely they can pay. But as I said, because again, we cannot look at the economics without productivity. What is inflation? Inflation is where so much money doesn't meets very little productivity or no productivity at all. And so, if we are looking at those numbers, let us not forget that when we talk about productivity affects the private sector's ability to pay. And the litmus test I'm going to say, do we have enough productivity that can ensure that the private sector can pay the amounts that have been quoted? The answer is no. So I'm saying, please, let us not make numbers out of the roof. Let us match numbers to productivity, because that way it would assure that the private sector can pay this amount of money, and at the end of the day, that we will not end up with a worsening inflation situation. Oh yeah, let me come again, and I'll give you another very good example. Just talking about what could happen if we push this narrative further.
Yeah.
What could happen if we push this further is simple. The private sector will lay off all their staff and only hire them on a maybe on a day rate basis. And what that means is they'll tell you, this is the job. How much is it going to take to do this job? You quote a job, and then they will tell you, okay, come and do it and go home. And that happened in the oil and gas sector. I'm talking from experience. When they started pushing so much benefits to the oil and gas workers, what happened? The companies decided to go off. In 1980s, the companies were using a lot more full-time staff and very little casual staff. In fact, they were begging the casual staff to become full-time. And that was what was happening. A lot of the casual staff were staff that were having, they were not very trained, they were semi-skilled, and they upskilled and were absorbed into the system. I'm talking because my dad joined the oil company in that era. But I can tell you today that they are pushing more for staff that are not full-time. They're pushing more for contract staff. Why? Because it helps them to avoid paying so much in terms of benefits to those staff. The full-time staff attract so much benefit. So now you have a ratio in any IOC where there are only 25 to 30% staff, and the rest are just casual staff. They're not full-time staff. And that's the way they've worked around it. So my point is, if you push the private sector, they will lay off every single person and tell them, look, you are not my staff. I'm not entitled to pay you this much. I'm going to give you a scope of work. It's a turnkey project. You tell me how much you want to take for that job. And if it takes you 1 year, that's your problem. I'm paying you for the job. I'm not paying you for your monthly appearance in office. So let's just be careful, because we've seen this happen in various sectors, and it doesn't look nice at all. In fact, if you don't handle it properly, it will become, modern day slavery.
Okay, Doctor, you've said a whole lot this morning, and I want to come starting from the oil and gas sector. We've had conversations about exploitation, mistreatment of Nigerian workers, and all of that. And oftentimes, it is traced back to the inability of the Nigerian government to prioritize issues of workers' welfare, to ensure strict compliance with labor laws, both the one that is, nationally, put in place, and the global labor laws. So, my line of question first is, if you take your mind back to the electioneering period, two things stood out crystal clear for all the presidential candidates: Labour Party, PDP, APC, NNPP. They all talked about the fact that fuel subsidy needed to go. That's one. On the other end, it was the issue of increasing the minimum wage. It all came from Peter Obi, 100,000 naira, as a then was the benchmark that it placed, that every Nigerian worker, irrespective of where you are, could be paid 100,000 naira. As we sit, that 100,000 naira, let's assume is even paid, cannot buy a bag of rice, a bag of gari, a bag of beans, and give you something to take home to take care of your health and other issues, let alone transportation. I know that the indices from the economic perspective might not be favorable. And there's a conversation you're trying to run away, but I'll take you to that conversation. For the longest time in Nigeria, the world over, we have been told, and we know that the cost of governance in Nigeria happens to be among the highest. So, the advocacy at this point is, can we have a leadership in Nigeria where issues of governance or the cost of governance is drastically reduced and that money shifted to pay or take care of workers? Now, if this happened, don't you think we'll be able to, find ourselves around the issue of fixing the economy?
Okay, thank you very much. I hear exactly what you've said. Like I said earlier, the issue of saying yes, 100,000 cannot buy anything it begs me to ask: are we trying to fix the 100,000, or are we trying to fix the issue of affordability with the 100,000? And for me, I would tell you that the most sustainable situation is to fix the macroeconomics. And if not, you move that 100,000, as I've said, even if you move it to 1 million, you might end up having a situation where even a bag of rice costs 1 million. And people say, oh, no, that's not true. That cannot happen. But go to Zimbabwe and find out how much it costs to buy bread. It costs sometimes, if you look at the exchange rate, it costs about 20,000 Zimbabwean dollars. Venezuela is even worse. About $10, you could be talking about 1 million, I think, is it pesos that they're using. Okay, so my point is the efforts should really be primarily on fixing the macroeconomics, and then after you can determine what is the ideal, minimum wage to be pushing for a better standard of living. Now, I have heard you say, talk about the need for reducing the cost of governance. I would like to put it very clear. I didn't run from that. I only said that it's a topic for another day, meaning we can talk about it all day long. However, since you brought it up, I would tell you that there is a bill for an act to substitute the annexure to Decree 24 of 1999 with a new governance model for the Federal Republic of Nigeria. Mm-hmm. And the act is currently looking at, among other things, how can we restructure? I think I'm hearing musings about the regional governance model. I'm hearing other musings. Now, I'm not going to go into it because it's still a developing matter. Yeah. It's not passed yet. It's not gotten that serious yet for us to start chewing it up. But I think I'd like to say that the act is, midwifing the consciousness that we need to reorganize the governance model to reduce the cost of governance, essentially. So, because the model of governance we're operating is two things. It's expensive, and it's very difficult to do checks and balances. So, that act is still there. We hear things like, okay, some, division of the country are not actually happy with some of the provisions of the act that is being driven up. The musings in there. They're asking for it to be changed. So a lot of things are still developing. But I'd like to say that it is not just you or people among the media space that are clamoring for a reduction in cost in governance. In fact, I am clamoring for a reduction, but that you could be allowed to earn more based on you bringing value. I'm clamoring, just like we have for example in the private sector, you have your basic salary, then you have your target bonus, and then you have your merit bonus benefits and all that. I do not mind if a lawmaker is making, mention the amount, so much money, but let most of it be tied to value. Let's know, just like the private sector, that you're bringing some value, and that value makes you entitled to that large amount of earnings. That is what I am pushing for. But just to answer your question more directly, yes, there's a wide consensus that if you, reduce the cost of governance, that it definitely can be injected back into the economy and would make a lot of difference. However, I think where there is still some debate is how to go about it, and some of the ways that have been posited, both from the, I think there was this report that was done by one of these experts, and that the president has asked for the implementation of that report. Those are some of the ideas in the civil service for cutting the cost of governance. I think it's the Agun Sayad's report. Yeah, correct. That if I've not gotten that wrong. Now we've also had this bill going forward to restructure the country and in a way, in doing so, reduce the cost of governance. So there's a number of evolving issues in that space. Too early to call a conclusion, but what I would say is that we can only add to the narrative to say, let's do what we have to do quickly, because we're running out of time, and we don't have enough time to linger on this forever.
All right, Dr. Enang, I would like to ask here, because along the line, even as the laborers were also clamoring for an increment in the minimum wage, the private sector also were they joined in that particular clamoring, and they were the first to suggest 54,000 naira before even labor, the federal government actually joined. Because you've talked about how the private sector are going to pay and all of it. Now, because if you look at the current minimum wage of 30,000 naira, you agree with me that even most private sectors have not been able to pay. Now, with them giving the suggestion of 54,000 naira, because they give the suggestion that they could pay 54,000 naira, what would you say about that?
Sorry, the line was a bit muffled. Can you come closer so that I can hear?
Okay, I asked the private sector during the negotiation of a minimum wage alongside organized labor suggested 54,000 naira before federal government also joined. If you follow the narrative well, they also joined with that. Now, what will you say? What will you say about that particular amount that the private sector, offered to pay as minimum wage?
I think the amount is realistic, and that's because if you look at the consumer pricing index, which is an overall indication of, how much the consumer prices have changed from, whenever you're trying to benchmark from, you'll find out that yes, the private sector can afford to pay that, but I'd like to say that we do not expect the same amount of workforce. I think like we have today. So I can tell you without a doubt that a lot of the private sector work, companies are going to adapt to this, in different ways. They're going to take more of casual workers based on turnkey agreements. This is how much work I want you to do. Can you give me a cost price? And whether you take 6 months, it doesn't matter. That's the same thing you will earn. The other thing that we're going to see happen is there's going to be a lot of digitalization. I'll give you context. I went to, a hospital in Nigeria, and they now have a very good inventory where you could book your appointment online. The doctor would, we assign to a doctor automatically. They will approve it. So what does that mean? A lot of their admin staff have been phased out completely. In fact, right now, they don't even have their own pharmacy. They do have a retainership with a pharmacy who is meant to operate 24 hours, or at least give essential services after late hours. And if you need it, they give you a prescription online, and then they give you a contact number, and you can call someone and pick it up at any time of the day. So I think a lot of things are going to get more efficient. But then it would mean that a lot of people would actually have to lose their job. So I mean, we've seen this. Let me say that what the Nigerian government is trying to achieve with the labor is not something that is new. We've seen this in different countries, and I'm telling you exactly how they adapt. So the answer is yes, the private sector will be able to afford it if they want to. But it will come at a consequence. Now, the point is, I always bring people to a certain theory that I learned in engineering, which says that energy cannot be created nor destroyed, but can be transformed from one form to another. The point there is, you don't make money out of thin air. And for someone to earn more money, that means somebody is losing some money. The question is to implement whatever figure that we have for the minimum wage, who is going to pay the price? And that's the question everybody should be looking at the mirror and asking themselves, because it could be you, it could be me, it could be anybody. And that is why I'm always saying the best fix is fix the macroeconomic conditions, which means that people can still survive with the lower amount. And also, in addition to that, it also means that you can create opportunities for people to expand their businesses. I'm never a fan of treating the symptoms without treating the underlying conditions. I'm not saying that treating the symptoms is bad, but I don't want you taking paracetamol for a month while your malaria is compounding, when you could have taken paracetamol to get down the fever and then start seriously treating the malaria with the same energy, so that you can get off the sick bed as soon as possible.
Okay, so as we sit, Doctor, there is an agreement seemingly between the Labour and the federal government. The few issues have been raised, some kind of an agreement. At this point in time, there is no official word from Labour whether or not the strike has been called off yet. What would be your advice to Nigerians and Nigerian workers? Are you in support of the sustained industrial action, or you would call for a change of mind on the part of the organized labor?
No, I'll plead for a change of mind from the organized labor, at least to allow time. So there's been some discussions, and other parties need time to reflect, the outcomes, and then, of course, look at the implementation. So I'll plead for a temporary, hold, because the truth is this: it always reflects on the gross domestic product of the country, and even the export earnings, it will reflect. So there is no way we can't eat our cake and have it back. And so the thing is, what is the aim of the strike? The aim of the strike is not to flex muscles. The aim of the strike is to allow the other parties to say, look, let's have a discussion. Okay, I've seen your influence in the social space. Let's have a discussion. But after that discussion, let's have a tentative draft of what the agreements have been, and then give time for implementation. Because at the end of the day, whether we make our economy worse or better, it's us that will feel the impact. And so I'm calling on Labour to please have a reconsideration and allow time for discussion. And also, I'm also calling for them to put into focus, and my question is this, it's going to be very rhetorical. The question is, what is the amount that the Labour are convinced will not totally throw Nigeria off balance from an inflation standpoint, will be adequate for for buying the surviving day to day in the economy, and also would be okay for the private sector to pay. And on that, I'd also ask, what is the arrangement of Labour from a committee to be able to engage the government in on timelines in terms of the restructuring of our economic outlook, such that we fix the macroeconomic problem? Because I do not agree with increasing the minimum wage and leaving the other part. So Labour needs to start asking themselves, what are we putting together, maybe at the Economic Engagement Committee, that will talk to the government and be able to engage the government on how to reform the country. I should be hearing, if the government cannot fix the country in a year, we'll go on strike. That's what I should be hearing, because those are the things that affect our buying power. We can fix the exchange rate to 400,000 or whatever, but what if a bag of rice is now 400,000? What use is that? I wrote an article recently saying the impact of the minimum wage on the standard of living, and I was able to draw inferences to show that from historical basis, when we increase the minimum wage, it doesn't really affect positively the standard of living compared to the previous numbers, of what it used to be, because inflation keeps going out of control. And so I think it is time for us to also put some energy, split the energy, put some on the minimum wage, put some on the economic reforms.
Absolutely. Split the energy, put someone in economic reforms and on minimum wage. But our conversation with you this morning, Dr. Wisdom Enong, has actually thrown up a lot of questions, and we can see that there are visible gaps. I'm particularly concerned where and what the stance of the private sector is in all of this. Whatever the labor union finally decides, I know it's presented in such a way that they're members of the organized private sector on that platform, but at the end of the day, Nigerians will hope that the best decision is made. Thank you so much for bringing both some more questions that we need to look into. It's been a great time of conversing with you on Rise and Shine this Tuesday morning.
Thank you very much, Uyai, and the team. Do appreciate, and of course, I'll be available to talk on topical issues anytime that the need comes up.
All right, then. Thank you so much. Do have a splendid day.